Prashant Sareen dates me a bit. I didn't know I would be seated here inviting him to the podium because his father was my friend.
Thank you so much, sir. It's a tough act to follow, starting with you and then Arif Sahab, Ajay. Thankfully, Tariq has still not spoken. Otherwise, I would have just given the floor. I would have not even decided to start off. But let me just start off by saying, and I'll come to why the book is important, but I had a very traumatic journey coming to this place because my younger daughter, who's just 10 years old, is he suddenly decided to read this book, I Am Malala. And I encouraged her. She doesn't understand most of the stuff. But today, while we were driving and I was telling her what this program is going to be all about, she asked questions which only a kid can ask. And she says, but why do these guys have, what is their problem if a girl is wearing shorts and running on a track or going for swimming or goes to school? Uh, Now, I think with most of the adults, it's easy to explain what's the problem. How do you explain a 10-year-old kid what's the problem? So I tried desperately. I don't think she was convinced by my explanation. But, this is why books like yours are important because they are going to, give a certain perspective to what's happening and why it's happening. The second, two or three observations, which I must say, we keep talking about why Muslim societies have given in or are behaving in the way they are doing. Part of the problem, I think, is explained by a Punjabi phrase, uh, which is that Rab nede ya kusund. Is the God closer to you or is the box closer to you? So, भाई मेरा मुक्का आपके ज़्यादा नज़दीक है कि रब आपके ज़्यादा नज़दीक है सो आई रब नेड़े या कुसुंड So the point is that a lot of people get taken in by this kind of a thing, and then of course I think there is a very important interview, very revealing interview by Al Jazeera, fabulously done by I guess a guy of Pakistani extraction of General Asad Durrani. Most of the people in India have been, were shocked by what happened in the Peshawar school. I wasn't. But let me just say one thing what the general says that this was collateral damage. It was collateral damage because his kids didn't die, so it was okay. That was acceptable collateral damage. But I think what is important is that when you are studying this entire phenomena, which is now we are familiar with it happening around the world, or at least in the Islamic world, I think it's extremely important to understand that a lot of this could not have happened but for the kind of absolutely monstrous strategic calculations of states. This kind of a phenomena cannot exist without some kind of state support. We keep talking about Pakistan. In Pakistan, it could not happen if the state had not supported it. And where, and I normally don't disagree with Ajay, but where I think Ajay has got something wrong is when he says that most Pakistanis identify themselves as Barelvis. They might. But if you hear the Barelvi discourse, and if you can distinguish it from the Wahhabi or the Deobandi or even the Shiite discourse, I don't think there's anything to choose between a fanatic of one sect or another. And yeah, but they're getting there. They're trying to get there. So I think there is this thing. But I think what is really important about Tariq is that, and what makes him such an important voice, even though I completely agree that I don't think it's a voice which is going to be heard by part of your target audience, is the fact that he owns his religion. Unlike you, Ajay, he's not an agnostic or an atheist. He's a believer. And I think that is what gives him a certain edge over many of the people, who are born Muslims, but then will start talking about Islam as though they are above it all. He is not above it all. And I think that is something which really makes him very important. And I think that's also the reason why he rubs the Islamists the wrong way. It's so easy for somebody who's out of the pale, to dismiss him outright that, the guy is a non-believer. But to do the same to Tariq, and then Tariq, given his, I think something has to be said for this Punjabi abrasiveness which he exudes. He's so much in your face that nobody really wants to enter into a slanging match with him. And not only is he into your face out of ignorance, it's out of knowledge. And I think that's what gives him that edge which most other people don't have. I think what is also good about this guy is, and I on Facebook and on Twitter, one keeps looking at him, and thank God for internet, which is why one got to know of Tariq Fateh, and YouTube, because one saw his videos and one was shocked that how can a guy be talking like this, but it was fabulous. But I think what is important is that his intellectual arrows are not aimed only against the Islamists. They might primarily be, because perhaps the problem is a little more out there. He's against fanaticism of all sorts. So I think that's again something which gives him a solid edge. One of the things which I found fabulous about the book was his take on Islamic history. Now, we in India have this thing that we've been coexisting with Islam and with Muslims for the last 1,000 years, even more. But it is shocking how little we know about Islam or of Islamic history. And I'm not talking about the people who study it, but I'm talking actually even the people who study it. But at a general level, the level of ignorance in India about Islam is astounding. And I think for my purpose, although because I look at Pakistan and I look at terrorism also very closely, so one has got familiar with a lot of these things. But I think it's extremely important for us to understand the trajectory of Islamic history. The very fact that Tariq talks about the way the Prophet's family has been treated, that was something which simply we were completely ignorant of. And I'll tell you how ignorant I was of Islam before I started reading up on it. I remember when I was a kid, we had a holiday one day, and as a kid, 8-10-year-old kid, I went to my dad and I wished him Happy Muharram. And my dad was horrified. He said, "What's wrong with you? If you don't know something, then don't say it." And because in our lexicon, a holiday is there must be a celebration, that's why you're given a holiday, So the level of ignorance is also very astounding, and I think this is an extremely important thing about this book. Of course, when we start talking about things like the ISIS, which incidentally I tried to figure out was the plural of ISI, so that kind of fits in quite well. But the brutality, the cruelty, the barbarism which is on display by them, frankly, I don't know why are we getting so horrified about it. What's so new about it? Tariq writes in his book, the Christians did it in Spain to the Muslims. We have, to the Muslims, to the Jews, to who. So the bottom line is that everybody's done it to everybody else. Now, he writes about what Ibn Saud did in Karbala, what Abdali did in Delhi, or Nadir Shah did in Delhi. How was it any different from what the ISIS is doing in the places which they are running? Or what the Taliban did in Afghanistan? How was it any different from what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has done in Iraq and Syria? It's the same thing. YouTube, a phone with a mobile with a camera. So yes, but so it's just too much in your face. Otherwise, the modus operandi is as old as mankind itself. So I don't think there is anything really new in terms of what the ISIS is doing. But I think the real problem to my mind is the silence which I see or which I don't hear, the voices which one should hear from the community itself, going hammer and tongs at these guys. Now it's very easy, and very often Muslims will say that, look, it's not our business to condemn everything shitty which is happening by somebody else. That's true. At the same time, I think it is important that the Muslim communities must stand up to be counted on this score, because this is at the end of the day also or primarily their problem, and I don't see enough outrage or enough activism in the Muslim communities around the world on this phenomena. There is a lot of lip service certainly which is paid, but I don't see them standing up to be counted. And part of the problem, I think, again, Tariq points out in his book, it's this kind of dualism which has come to operate. So when the Saudis demolished the shrines in Mecca and Medina and rest of Saudi Arabia, there's not a peep out of anybody. There's a Babri Masjid, and this is certainly not as a justification for what happened, but there is a Babri Masjid which is demolished, and it is as though the Mecca, the holy mosque in Mecca has been demolished. It wasn't like that, but that dualism which one sees is something which is again quite important. Of course, Saudi Arabia has the money, and they've hijacked the faith with their literal and puritanical interpretation, so they probably get away with everything. But that's a fact. The other thing which I find kind of strange is, this whole business of Islam is in danger. This is a clarion call to arms, but to my mind, does it show the fragility of the faith? Perhaps it does, not in the sense what Mr. Gill was talking about, spirituality, but in the sense of political power. And for the Islamists, I think, unless they have political power, Islam is in danger, or at least their version of Islam is in danger, and which is why we see a lot of the kind of stuff happen around the world. Why the ISIS becomes, or organizations like this, to my mind, become such a dangerous phenomena, is that most of the states in the regions where they are operating are weak states. They might appear to be very hard states like Saudi Arabia and others, but at their core they are essentially very, very fragile states. The problem now is that these states are now getting embroiled in needless fights, partly to destabilize neighbors, partly to impose their influence on their neighbors, and they neither have the capacity nor the capability, and certainly not the vitality to carry this thing through. And to my mind, this is a huge problem, because what is going to happen is that the fanatics know what they want, but I'm not very sure if these states know what they want, and which is one of the reasons why these states are falling like dominoes all the time. But what I find quite shocking really is that, when you looked at a state like Syria, say 15 years back, or you looked at, even a Libya for that matter, even Egypt for that matter, most of these places were extremely civilized countries. Syria certainly, Lebanon for example, and yet, their descent into the kind of chaos that they have fallen into, and the kind of barbarism which one is seeing, is something which I find very difficult to believe. There was some talk out here of imperial conspiracies and how borders were drawn up and stuff like that. Now, frankly, I don't think there's anything intrinsically artificial about states which were created post 1914 from the debris of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, throughout the history of mankind, states have been created arbitrarily. जहाँ तक आपका बाजुए कुव्वत था, आप अपनी रियासत बनाते थे, and after that was the end of the रियासत. Nobody questions the legitimacy of the state when it's formed. Now, of course, there could be people who subscribe to the theory of mobile republics of one or of village states, which also are not homogeneous. But frankly, there was nothing intrinsically artificial about either of Lebanon, of Syria, or any of the other states which were formed. So for people to question, Ajay, to use your language, that arbitrary line, well, that line was drawn. These lines have been drawn throughout history. In the subcontinent, normally a state survives for about 200, 250 years, give or take 50 years. After that, new states come up. So there is nothing, I think, sacrosanct about a state or what will actually form a state. And to question this is to really turn the entire history of mankind, political evolution on its head. Finally, I just want to, something which I was provoked, not just by reading Tariq's book, but actually by an article which I read by a Pakistani diplomat in a paper yesterday, about how Pakistan is now in the vanguard of the fight against Islamophobia. Now I just have two things to say on this. Number one, when countries like Pakistan or the rest of the Muslim world talk about Islamophobia, I think they also need to talk about non-Islam phobia in Islamic countries. I don't think there's enough attention paid on that. The scandalous treatment of non-Muslims in many of these Islamic countries is something nobody ever talks about. The kind of stuff which happens in some of these countries like Saudi Arabia and others, how come that is kosher, and say a law which is passed in say Switzerland or France or any other country become Islamophobia? I'm not defending the length of a skirt which somebody should wear. Should be a matter of their personal choice. Or whether a person should wear a burqa or not wear a burqa, that is again a matter of personal choice. But when you point a finger of Islamophobia and you create this whole furor over Islamophobia, then I think it's equally important to talk about non-Islamophobia also. And I don't think enough is done on that. The second thing is, I think it is incumbent on Muslim societies to also introspect as to what is creating this Islamophobia. And I don't think it's what was it you said? Belligerent self-pity. I don't think that's the answer to this. There has to be that reform which must come in Islamic societies where, and I'm a strong believer, and this is again something which I completely identify with Tariq. If I go to Canada and I want Islamic law or Hindu, actually, has Islamic law ever been codified? No, codified in the sense like exactly codified. Because when I look at the debates in Pakistan, when I look at yes, exactly.
If we are looking for municipal law of how broad a street is, no. That's what I meant. But if you want a law to define how far you should sit with the woman over there, then there is.
No, but Arif Saab, that is exactly the point I was trying to make. Because I look at the debate.
No. So, I mean, Hidayah, which was the dominant Hanfi Sunni law, that is different. The law, fatwa of Deoband is different from Barelvi fatwa.
No, but which is.
It's only a matter of how many feet you
Right.
So, which actually makes it a kind of a municipal law, because in this room it could be 3 feet, in some other room it could be 2 feet, and if you are not aware of all those distances, then you're probably breaking the law most of the time. So, and the sentence for that is, I think, either.
There is no sentence.
Okay.
In fact, if he chooses, she can be a sex slave. And in that case, feet will not matter.
Exactly. No, but so the point which I'm trying to make is that, I look at the debate in Pakistan, for example, on bringing in Sharia law. Nobody in Pakistan has ever defined what Sharia law is. partly because, as you very rightly say, every sect has its own interpretation of what is Islamic law. So what they come up with is that I think in the 1950s or something, some 20 or 30 of the mullahs had got together and come out with a 20-point statement. And I saw that 20-point statement. If that is the law on which basis of which you are going to go, you can't get a law. You can't codify it.
Tariq Sahab has pointed out the mullahs did not agree even on the definition of who is a Muslim.
But here's the thing. He's right. But what they managed to agree on was on who is not a Muslim.
Everyone else was an
Yes. So they managed to agree on that how they can excommunicate somebody or throw somebody out of the pale. That they agreed on, and which is why, the Munir Commission report points this out, but post Munir Commission report, they all ganged up together to decide who is not a Muslim. And now the problem is coming whether Shias are Muslims or not Muslims. I don't know how that debate is going to go eventually. It will depend on whether Saudi Arabia survives or not. But so the thing is that, this problem of it's partly a problem of all societies, like Indians go and tend to live in ghettos wherever they go. But this whole business of I go to the US or I go to Australia or I go to Canada and I want my personal law out there. Damn it, if you want your personal law, then stay in the shithole from where you came. Why do you need to go somewhere else? You can't be going to somebody else's place and saying that this is what I want. So I think this problem of assimilating and imbibing and living in the cultures to which you go is another problem which is there. Finally, and I would sound a note of caution. I think you are very optimistic, Ajay, on not enough Indians have gone to join the IAS, etc., from Bangladesh and all of that. Perhaps statistically you're right. But I think we would be remiss if we think that the phenomena which is sweeping the rest of the Islamic world will pass us by. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think it would be extremely dangerous for us to ignore this thing. I think the government of India did a very sensible thing that when this ISIS thing happened and the shrines in or the places in Iraq were under threat, we suddenly saw about 10 or 13,000, 15,000 Shias get together, and I think a lot of it was probably a paid crowd. But the point is that the way the government cracked down on that and said nothing doing, there will be nobody going for private wars. I think that was a sensible thing. But this kind of a thing we need to have the state get involved in this and ensure that these fires are not caught on out here. The problem is not only in India but rest of the world that there is no counter narrative. Tariq's book tries to come up with a counter narrative, but as Arif Saab said, who are you trying to preach to? They don't want to listen to you. So I really think the challenge is not only to make people read this book, but make them understand this and then take the kind of counter narrative steps which need to be brought in, so that we are not affected by the phenomena which the West is facing. And the West is facing it because of their apologism of Islamism. And I think that is extremely important. It's a caution which the government of India will ignore at its own peril. I'll end out there. Thanks.